How you doing? Continue with this whole idea of people in sports, which is what we've titled the section on sport sociology. We want to talk about the 3 Cs of sport sociology. The 3 Cs, for us in this class anyway, include culture, community, and then competition. So culture, let's talk about what is it, and then what are some of the components of culture that are going to be useful for us. What does the word community mean, and how is it going to be useful for you all that are going to work within the sport industry? Finally, what about competitions? Well, there's a lot going on within this discussion of competition. Firstly, where do we learn competition? And that's going to involve socialization. Secondly, how do we learn to be a part of this whole idea of organized competition or sport? And then finally, how do we literally organize competitions? These are going to be the things, the concepts, and the questions that guide us moving forward in this particular lecture. Firstly, culture. Culture can be defined as a social heritage of a person or a people. This is going to include learned patterns of thinking, behaving, and acting that are going to be essential for participation in daily life of that group. Important to this whole idea of culture are the norms and the values. The values are going to be things that are collective ideas of what we define as right, desirable, and good. This is going to be interesting because separate institutions within a culture are going to have different values. But collectively, all the institutions and all the values are going to be part of and really what helps to develop the culture. Think about the different cultures associated with sport. In your assignment you have Skateistan, or you can watch the video here, which really takes the idea of sport to Afghanistan and watches the culture in Afghanistan, the culture of sport or skating, and how they combine together to develop their own culture. As a result, there are going to be these separate norms and values and things that are going to be useful for understanding the people that are part of that particular group. Norms, I've talked about that before. Norms are what we should or should not do in certain situations. There's a lot of different ways to evaluate and understand and categorize norms. You have folkways, mores, and laws, or what we have here that we'll talk about are prescriptive and proscriptive. Prescriptive, are the norms that say this is what we should be doing. So, especially within the world of sport, the things that we should be doing: working hard, giving your 110% every single time you go out on the basketball court, for example. Or maybe in practice, working hard, demonstrating that work ethic. Proscriptive are the things not to do. So, do not disrespect your coach or other authority figures in sport. Do not take advantage of the student-athlete role. Do not engage in performance-enhancing drug or substance use. So that's what norms are, what you should and should not do in certain situations. Norms and values within the world of sport, what they do is they help to develop the culture. Perhaps you've heard of different teams or sport organizations. In the NFL, they talk about the New England Patriots and the Patriot Way. Well, the Patriot Way is a euphemism for an organizational culture. So what you're going to find within sport, recreation, and physical activity is oftentimes you can have a national culture, like American culture. You can also have cultures that are unique to specific sports. So Seth Wickersham, for a very long time on ESPN.com, wrote about the culture of stoicism and masculinity and hiding injuries within the NFL. So you can have a culture within that sport and within that league. Or you can have cultures on a particular team or within a particular community. Cultures are very, along with norms and values, they're very flexible ways for understanding sport, recreation, and physical activity. So think about American values. Think about values important to a community and how local sports teams or recreation opportunities really embody those values. So in the state of Colorado, for example, which is considered the healthiest state in the United States, there is the value of health and fitness. And so as a result, since that's a value that's built into the culture of many of the different towns in Colorado, and we're sort of pejoratizing here, but just for an example, what specific communities do to play in part to that value is develop the natural environment around the community for walking trails, rock climbing, bike lanes on roads, things like that. That's a way that you can embody a local value in a community culture. In addition to the word culture, another important C word in sports is this whole idea of community. And community can imply a lot of different things. It can imply geography, or this whole idea of psychography, or psychographic research really gets into looking at and understanding kind of the collective psychology of what constitutes a community. Community can be defined in a lot of different ways, but think about how you define it. As you see, there are a lot of different definitions, and there's a definition listed on this particular slide. That definition says, a community is the social unit of any size that shares common values. Although embodied or face-to-face communities are usually small, larger or more extended communities such as national community, international community, and virtual community are also studied. So if we're talking about investment in a group of individuals, that's what psychographic research really looks at. And so the Derby Recreation Commission, when they were doing some research in terms of looking at the recreation services that they provide to their community, one of the things that they noticed is that their community actually extended beyond the city of Derby. So for those of you that are not familiar with Derby, Derby is a town that's here in Wichita. It's a smaller town outside of Wichita, and has the DRC, the Derby Rec Commission, offers a lot of sports, a lot of physical activity programming and services for people far outside the city of Derby. So that means community is more than just geography. If you think about a virtual community, you think about online message boards for a particular team. If you think about fans of a particular team all over the world, that is a community, and how they communicate is going to be different than the traditional definition of community that maybe we had 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. But nonetheless, community is a very powerful idea in the world of understanding not only business, but also sports sociology. If we're looking and kind of extending and blending what culture and community are, ideologies is a great sort of conceptual idea that bridges those two different concepts. An ideology is an idea that people construct to give meaning to make sense of the world around them. That's it. So it's kind of like expectations of what should or should not happen. So it's sort of similar to norms and values. It's kind of in that vein. Within the world of sociology or social science, there are kind of main ideologies that we talk about, sport-based ideologies. So a gender ideology would be the old adage, you throw like a girl. And so as a result, what you're doing is that you're explaining how the concept of gender is embodied in the world of sport through that particular ideology. Now, as many of us know, that old-fashioned sort of archaic idea of throwing like a girl being a way to impugn a young boy playing baseball, for example, that idea is starting to change and evolve. But if we're thinking about a racial ideology in sport, the whole idea that white men can't jump. There are white men that can jump and can jump very effectively. But nonetheless, when we think about something like basketball, a cultural race-based ideology here in the United States is that certain races may be more predisposed to being successful in other sports. A class-based ideology is looking at and understanding the world of sport participation, for example, and how it relates to money. If you're talking about traveling baseball, AAU basketball, or dance and cheer competitions, these things are very, very expensive. Think about youth sports and how much I know people that spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars for their children to participate in sport locally here every single year. If you have two kids and each wants to be involved and you have private lessons, you might be looking at $200 to $300 per month. For a lot of people that's a car payment. For other people that's a way of thinking about sport participation for their kids. So these are just different ideologies associated with sport and how we understand our expectations and really how we process what's going on in sports around us. Finally, let's talk about competitions. How do we learn about competitions? How are they organized? I think it's really important for us to think of competition as an activity. And once we do that, then we can start to really build an understanding of what competition or sports can be. So activities must be learned and they must be organized. Therefore, it's similar to that definition of sports that we had from Dr. Jay Coakley in previous lectures. But let's look at how we can better understand all facets of competitions. And this is going to include us looking at how we learn about sports, how to get and stay involved in sports, and ultimately how they're going to be organized. How we learn about competition or sport is through a process called socialization. It's not socializing. Socialization is an active process of learning and social development. It usually involves interaction with other people. It's going to involve the formation of ideas about who we are and what is important in our lives, and this includes our view or perception of sports. Generally in society, you have these, what they call, quote-unquote, agents of socialization. And these are going to be very important entities for helping us as individuals learn what it means to be part of a larger group. That's what socialization is, learning to be part of a larger group. The unit of the family is going to be important to socialization. Religion for some people is. Media and entertainment. But also peer networks, the friends that you hang out with. But also this whole idea of participating in sports. For example, how do we learn? We don't just learn about a sport and that we enjoy playing it. We learn how to be a fan. And oftentimes media and entertainment teaches us what it means to be a fan. Taking this example one step further. When I was younger, you displayed your fandom for a particular franchise by watching that particular professional football team, for example. Maybe you had a shirt or a sweatshirt. Maybe you had a hat, but that was pretty much it. What was really big when I was growing up were those felt pennants that you would then hang on your wall in your bedroom. But that was pretty much it. Now look at how people display their fandom. We've seen people that get tattoos, so they literally modify their body. People spend hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars on elaborate tailgating activities. Maybe they buy extra vehicles and paint them up. You have gourmet food. You bring a very large custom-made grill to a tailgating party, stuff like that. I mean, that's very different. But how do we learn? If I don't do that, am I a fan? Am I as much of a fan as someone else who does all of that? Well, to answer that question and to be part of a fan or a fan culture of that particular team, you learn by looking at what is around you, and oftentimes media or your peer groups can really help you understand that process. When you become involved or you want to stay involved with sport, recreation, and physical activity, we kind of look back to interactionist theory and research. And what it really says is that participation is related to something that involves how we make decisions. So it's an ongoing process in our life as a person. It's not just a one moment in time type of thing. It's something that happens throughout the entire life course. And we make decisions associated with the social circumstances around us, the people that are around us, our comfort level with those people, and then our willingness to be involved in that particular activity. This constantly evolves. It's not, I'm a part of this community and that's it. You have to reaffirm your participation in that community. And then maybe over the years, maybe you decide you're not a fan of that particular sport or that franchise or that team any longer, and you move to another one. So these decisions that we make happen all the time. Donnelly and Young had this sort of monumental research where they talked about what it means to become an athlete and be involved in a sport culture. They were looking at maybe rugby players, rock climbers, things like that. But it came down to three basic things that influenced involvement in a sport culture. Number one was acquiring knowledge of the sport or the activity. This is important because if I'm going to learn rugby, or if I'm going to be part of a rugby team or rugby culture, I have to know rugby. Well, if I don't know rugby, and I didn't grow up around rugby or any sports like that, I have to acquire knowledge of it. Okay? Step two is to associate with people of that sport culture and then to learn the norms and the values of that sport. So maybe I don't know anything about rugby and I find it interesting, and so I do some research on the internet or through the library, and I find that I'm able to learn the history of rugby. I'm able to learn the rules of the game, maybe some strategies of the game. Well, to really be a part of the rugby culture, I have to associate with people that are associated with the sport. Once I get involved with the people, then I'm able to learn really the norms of the sport. That's step two. Then finally, step three is that once I have the knowledge, I am hanging out with the people, I'm investing in the people in the community, and I learn the unwritten rules of that particular sport or culture, then I become accepted. And that acceptance can come in a lot of different forms. It really depends on the sport or the physical activity that we're talking about. Regardless, though, this very, very simple process, this is what really helps us talk about involvement. And really, in terms of initially becoming an athlete or someone that's going to be involved in a particular sport-based culture, this is how we do it. Another great example was in the early 2000s, looking at the locker rooms of women's ice hockey teams. And basically what research said was that these locker rooms are key places where these women bonded with each other and developed a sense of community. The relationships that they had with each other helped to support themselves in terms of their identities and the meanings that they applied to participating in this sport. And then eventually those meanings would carry on from not just the sport but also into the other parts of their lives. Now this is a particularly interesting finding because when we're talking about women's hockey, ice hockey, here historically in the United States, that was a male-dominated sport. And so women that were participating in this very physical, very masculine-oriented sport, oftentimes the only support that they had was from each other. And that's what we're talking about here, is that we're talking about that sense of community, we're talking about that sense of culture and understanding each other, and that's going to be found in this competition, in the competition between these two teams. So locally, for example, I've used rugby a few times as an example. I had some friends that played on the rugby team, and so I got to know the individuals. I learned about the sport, and I always thought it was interesting was after a match, the two opposing teams would go to a social that was jointly hosted. So the two teams that were very physical and trying to tackle each other and all this physicality between them hours earlier, there was an avid sense of competition. Well, afterwards, there was an avid sense of community and respect because they were both involved in this thing that we call rugby. It's sort of a marginalized sport here locally. There weren't a lot of people that would attend the matches unless they were intuitively associated with people or that were playing or intuitively knew the game and kind of brought their love of rugby to Wichita if they came here. And so there was that sense of community. And that's kind of what's going on here is the meaning, the bonding, the solidarity, community, the culture of rugby, the culture of women's ice hockey, all these things. Sport is a place where we learn. We learn a lot of different things. We learn norms and values. We learn how to be a part of a group. We learn how to be a part of a community and how that community can influence us as an individual. Finally, let's talk a little bit about structure. The way that we organize our competitions does provide kind of a sense of expectation. All right, so the three levels of organization of competition or sport, starting here at the most basic level. Interpersonal is the most micro level, okay, and it's dealing with relationships between people, maybe player-coach, maybe GM and coach, maybe amongst the players, amongst the fans, those type of things. Moving to the next one, we have group level of organization, and this might be the interaction within a sport between a couple of groups. The example I give is the Major League Baseball Players Union and Major League Baseball. Okay, there's interactions amongst those two organizations within the context. And finally, we have societal. So structure of social relations in an entire society. So sport, as this large social or societal institution, includes sport businesses, manufacturers, governing bodies, media outlets, people that are associated with providing participation opportunities. So when you think about the three levels of organization, I can't really draw it here with my pen, but think about, concentric circles. The interpersonal is the smaller circle, and then outside of that is the group level, and then outside of that is going to be the societal level. And the further you get away from the middle, the larger you get, the more you're going to understand the movement from the micro, which is interpersonal, all the way to the macro. And then in the middle, you have group, which is going to be your meso level, that middle level. That's what we're talking about with structure within competitions. The structure of sport helps us to really understand what we call the institutionalization of sport. And this is when a sport becomes institutionalized, it becomes much more common and everyday in that particular culture. Now, we're not going to watch this YouTube video, but I really kind of recommend that you take some time and watch how folk games, which were very, very sort of de-institutionalized, they didn't have a lot of structure. But it's kind of places and activities that were associated going back even to the Middle Ages. You had maybe entire towns, villages, communities that would be involved. But sport, as it becomes larger and larger as an institution is one of those things that organizes, directs, or executes the essential tasks of living in a particular society. Now, this is coming from kind of a functionalist point of view, but basically then sport plays an important role in our society. One of the things it does is it helps to socialize the participant. It teaches us how to be a part of American culture. And so because it does that, it has become institutionalized in that many people grow up understanding sport is a huge part of American culture. Whether they are involved in sport or not, they know the importance of sport in American culture. But to understand modern sport, there are two major ideas that we really want to focus on moving forward. One is a status. And a status is the individual, the person's social position within an authority, organizational, or social group. Think of the status that people have, whether it's a professional athlete, coaches, administrators, managers. Think about sport managers behind the scene, but if you tell people that you work with the Oklahoma City Thunder, you probably have some status there. Your master status is the key status or the most important and highly visible status that really influences how people interact with you. And so I give the great sort of the timeless example of a student athlete on a college university campus. That student athlete is a lot of different things. But the status of being an athlete That's how people know that individual, more so than as a student or as a sibling or as, an employee of an organization, whatever it is. The master status is the key thing that influences how people are going to interact. A role is basically the right, the duty, the obligations associated with whatever it is that you're doing. Culture, society tends to define this. And as a result, each role is going to have specific expectations or norms associated with it. It's interesting to note, though, as individuals, we generally have multiple roles, okay? And that's our role set. Person might be a student, a mother and a father, also a child, or maybe they're an athlete. They're not just one thing. Now, how society interacts with them, that's a whole different thing. Sometimes you have these multiple roles that come into conflict, known as role conflict. And this I see a lot, obviously, every single semester if you have student athletes in a class. Many of the student athletes want to be in class, but their role of being an athlete on scholarship or on a particular team here at Wichita State University sometimes does conflict with academics. Not necessarily in that they don't want to be there, they don't want to do the work, but literally travel schedule might conflict with when we actually have class. So these roles and these statuses are going to be very important for understanding the individuals associated with organized sport or organized competitions. All of these things, whether we're talking about norms, values, statuses, roles, these are all structural arrangements. And these things, these structural arrangements in sports help to formalize an individual's identity within sport. If you're an athlete and that's how every single person views you, then you are more likely to see yourself as an athlete more than anything else. What this does is this can lead to disengagement problems. You always hear about retirement issues. People retire from high school sports, from college sports, professional sports. But if you've been one thing your entire life and then you wake up one day and you don't have that anymore, whether it's through retirement or whether it's through injury, those are going to be very, very difficult things, not just sociologically speaking, but also psychologically speaking. We've talked a lot in this particular lecture. We've talked about the 3 C's, if you will, of culture, community, and then understanding competitions. Culture is important for knowing how your sport or sport organization can impact people. Community is going to be important for you to know about, so you really get a sense for who is being impacted by your sport or sport organization. And it also behooves us all to realize that competitions or sporting events really are places, not just physical but also social places, where individuals learn different values and how to be a part of something larger than themselves. And what all these things really do is organize and help us to understand our thoughts with regards to groups of people, whether it's society or culture. Individuals are very complex. Neighborhoods are very complex. Cities and towns are very complex. States and nations, all of these societies are very complex. But they all work together, and we really need some ideas that help us to understand how one individual can really be excited about being a part of the Green Bay Packer organization. Someone who lives in Kansas, but that still has an emotional relationship with a professional football team thousands of miles away in a different state. How do you help to understand that? When you are working in your sport organizations, how do you get people to connect with the physical fitness programs that you're trying to develop for them? How do you get people to connect with the products and services that you as a recreation department are trying to give to a community? And how do you get people to connect in terms of purchasing merchandise or tickets or wanting to be a part of your high school, your college, or your professional sport organization? That's really what sociology is trying to help us do, is to understand people and to understand sports. In our industry of sport, people are at the center. So how do we bridge all those divides? That's what we're trying to do here.